A few days ago, as some 60 Shanghai residents who had petitioned the government were leaving my office, I was so pained and couldn't help shedding tears as I watched their figures recede into the bitter cold. It took me a long time to calm down, and sad scenes kept flashing through my mind. I saw the feeling of helplessness in the eyes of Du Youngmin, an older man, and in his trembling hands as he tried to button up his thick coat when leaving my office. I thought about the adverse circumstances they were facing in the severe winter and about how they might be arrested at any moment. Of these 60 or so men and women, only 3 or 4 hadn't been subjected to illegal forced labor. The rest had all suffered this cruel form of treatment at the hands of the Shanghai People's Government.
Welcome to Asia Talk. I'm Shelley Zhang. Now, what you just heard was a passage from this book titled A China More Just. It is the story of Gao Zhisheng, one of the most acclaimed human rights lawyers in China today. With us today is Sarah Cook, the co-editor of A China More Just. She'll be talking to us about the book and about Gao's story. Thank you for joining us today, Sarah.
Thanks a lot for inviting me, Shelley.
Now, who is Gao Zhisheng? Why is it important that people know about him?
Gao is one of those people that you don't see come along very often. He's one of those incredibly courageous and compassionate and passionate individuals. Somebody like Martin Luther King, or some people have compared him to Gandhi. A lot of people are talking about him as the conscience of China. Somebody who, he has this incredible story of having grown up in a cave, teaching himself law with only a middle school education, and going on to be one of the most important lawyers in China, and somebody who's really managed to rally both the activist community and people who've been working on lots of different human rights issues, and even ordinary citizens, and getting them to think a little bit more about human rights, think a little bit more about how to bring positive change to China in a nonviolent way. So I think, especially because these kinds of stories aren't something you often read about in the Western press, especially the way he writes the book and the stories that he tells of the people he's met and the individual experience he has of like growing up in rural China and his travels and things like that. It's one of those, windows into a world that we're not usually privy to. And especially just like that passage that we just heard, when your average Westerner goes to Shanghai, you don't think about the fact that there may be people there who are petitioning and being sentenced to labor camps. So I think that that's one of the things that Gao does, both in terms of bringing that to light in this book and in a lot of his writings, but also just in terms of him having spoken to those petitioners, tried to help them, and defended them in court in some cases.
Now, tell us about the book. How did that come about?
Basically, the book's a collection of writings of Gao, some of which were published before the book came out, originally in Chinese in May 2006, and then now having been translated into English just within the last couple of months. Some of the pieces were pieces that he'd published online previously. There's a journal he kept that's kind of like the day in the life of a Chinese dissident, where it's like, today there are 5 police cars outside my house, and they followed my daughter to school. Though he's quite witty about it, so it actually, in an interesting way, comes across very amusing.
And actually, one of the things that I found quite interesting was the way the book is arranged. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Basically, I think the book, it goes really in chronological order. So it really takes you through this journey that Gao himself has gone through, as starting as this little boy and growing up in rural China, who then goes on to become a lawyer. And it takes you all the way through the obstacles that he confronts when he's trying to take cases that are human rights cases before the Chinese legal system that, as many people know, is really controlled by the Communist Party. And the obstacles he comes up across, and this increasing disillusionment that he goes through with the system, where he sees the unfairness, he talks to judges and they just won't take some of his cases. He starts to see how things are useless, especially when he comes across the case of people who practice Falun Gong. And so you see this journey that he goes through where he ends up in this place of saying, look, this system is completely corrupt. There's really no way we're going to change the Communist Party. He himself quits the Communist Party on what he calls the proudest day of my life. And he starts rallying more and more people in a nonviolent way with this hunger strike to try to change things, and to saying every person in China is an agent for change. So let's take this into our own hands and peacefully try to bring about change. And that's really where the book ends. So it ends with really on a high note, I think, of this incredible mobilization, one of the most important grassroots mobilizations in China in recent years.
So it does quite sound like an inspiring story.
It is, yeah. I mean, when you think about human rights in China, a lot of times you think about these, very, very difficult situations, and he certainly talks about that too. But the hope that he has for change and the long-term vision that he has of being like, look, we're going to outlive this. We're going to outlive the Communist Party. We're going to outlive all of this oppression that's happening right now in China. And we as Chinese people, it's really up to us to change things, and we have the power to do that. And to me, what's really impressive is how his emphasis on nonviolent means. And I think that's why a lot of people have compared him to Martin Luther King or to Gandhi.
Now, has this book made an impression in China?
It's interesting that you ask that, because actually this book, the Chinese version, is banned in China. People in China can't get a hold of it. It's one of those things that the Communist Party has kept a very tight lid on. And it was published by this publishing house that actually, that's what it specializes in. It has this niche of publishing books that are banned in China. So one of the things that Gao talks about in this interview he gave when the book first came out in Chinese is how that saddens him, that he had to use the kinds of words that he needs to use about the troubles and the problems in China to describe it, but also that people in China can't accept it, or that it's not allowed in China for people to even read it. Which is also one reason why I think the publishing house felt it was important to publish it in English, because there's a lot of ways in which that kind of information comes out to the West and then goes back into China. You see that pattern happening. And so I think that was also one reason why they wanted to make it accessible to a Western audience.
Well, that's an important point that you made, that I think often we don't realize how much of what happens in the West does filter back into China. Now, of course, often when we have a book that we talk about, we'd like to have the author with us, but we couldn't have Mr. Gao here today, obviously. Can you tell us what his current situation is?
I wish I knew, to be honest. Right now, we don't know where he is. He was abducted by the Chinese authorities on September 22nd, and it's been almost 3 months now, and nobody's seen him since. Basically what happened was it's kind of a long story, but he was under house arrest, and for the most of 2007. And in September, he wrote an open letter to U.S. Congress detailing a whole bunch of abuses, and especially related to the Olympics and the lead up to the Olympics. So talking about people being kicked out of their homes as a result of the Olympics and stadiums being built and things like that. He talks about the persecution of Falun Gong that's ongoing, the religious persecution, human rights defenders being cracked down on. And basically one of the things he says in the letter is that he as a Chinese is very proud to have the Olympics having come to China, but he sees it as being a mechanism for oppression, a mechanism for, giving credence to a regime that he doesn't feel should have that kind of legitimacy. And so he actually called on the U.S. government to boycott the Olympics. And he said that a lot of people in China are calling it the Bloody Olympics or the Handcuff Olympics. And the next day they came and a bunch of plainclothes policemen came to his house and took him, and nobody knows where he is right now. And he'd been in detention for 4 months last year in 2006, and he was tortured. So a lot of people are very worried about him, and there are several campaigns and initiatives now that especially lawyers outside of China are taking to try to pressure the Chinese government to release him.
And Sarah, as an American, how did you become involved in Gao's story?
Well, I've actually been following human rights in China for a while, and I was studying in London, and I was involved with Amnesty International and the student group on my campus there. And so when the Chinese regime started cracking down on Gao because of his human rights work, there were several urgent actions asking us to write to the Chinese authorities, especially if there was an assassination attempt against him. And so that's how I first heard about him. And when he was doing this relay hunger strike for human rights, where he got all these different activists from different places together, and people from 29 provinces who joined the relay hunger strike, they started being arrested. And there was this Amnesty International release with all these people's names, and I was like, whoa, all these people that I'd seen doing different things, all of a sudden were doing the same thing. And that was for me the moment when I realized his importance in China and his importance for the future of China. So we actually did a relay hunger strike on our campus to join that, and had a lot of students joining in on that. And then after that, when the people who were working on the book were working on editing it, they knew that I'd been following his story for a while, so they asked me to help with the chronology and with some of the editing of the English, because I knew a lot of his story. I was familiar already with it.
So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about Gao's upbringing and how he went from growing up in a cave to becoming a renowned lawyer. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.